Kira. That was actually really helpful, really timely, because recently for the Australia Post app, we hit up the folks at Utopia as well and did a bit of an audit, and we're going through the process of trying to patch a couple of holes in our app for accessibility. So really timely. So my name's Dave. I'm a product designer at the moment at Australia Post. I've been working there and exclusively on the AusPost app for just over 2 years. And as Rick mentioned, previously, I had a bit of a developer background as well. I've always been obsessed with apps, always wanted to be coding apps and making my own apps. So it was a great opportunity when I got to work at Australia Post to work on their app. So my talk I've called Shooting for the Stars. So the story of transforming the AusPost app by focusing on the customer. It's a real mouthful, but essentially what I'm touching on there is a couple of years ago, so the Australia Post app was only rated about 2 stars in the App Store. And right now on iOS, we're at 4.8, which has been a really big change, which has been really exciting. And when I say shooting for the stars here, of course, I talk about the App Store star rating, but it's also just about, in general, trying to exceed expectations, the classic shooting for the stars. So here's just a bit of a screenshot of what it looks like if you go to download the AusPost app. Of course, it can do a lot of the stuff you'd expect for tracking your parcels, but also a lot of stuff you might not expect, like being able to pay for your bills or even verify police checks. Probably does too much, which I'll touch on in a bit. But just curious, who actually has the Australia Post app installed? Okay, just a small amount. Yeah, cool. What we find a lot of the time is just that the people aren't actually aware that there is an Australia Post app, which is interesting. Hopefully we can start fixing that. So for those that might be curious, like how big's the team? How many people are actually working on the Australia Post app? We have 3 iOS developers and an iOS lead, 3 Android and a lead. We've got 1 API developer. We've got an iteration manager, a QA tester, business analyst, and 1 designer, which is me. So yeah, just curious for the room. So who actually works as a designer? There's a couple before. Okay, decent amount. And what about developer? Okay, and anyone else in the product space or anything? Yeah. Cool, awesome. So the AusPost app, for a bit of context, so we've got a bit over 500,000 monthly active users, so people that use it every single month. And we have just under 6 million visits within the last month into the app. So it's quite a lot of people, which is pretty exciting because any change you do has a massive impact. So I'm going to talk really about that App Store rating and that change. So for this talk, it kind of goes in 2 parts. One bit, I'll talk about the story of that transformation, some of the key activities we did. And then for the second part, try and really highlight some of those key points, which hopefully will be a lot more relevant to everyone, even if you don't work on apps. And a quick caveat, of course, even though we're at 4.8 stars, the app is never perfect. And I know there's a whole bunch of issues with it right now that could be improved. If you do use it and you have any issues with it, let me know afterwards. So I'll talk about the story of transforming the AusPost app. And this is purely from my perspective, since I've been at Australia Post. So some people at AusPost might not agree with this. But from my perspective, I'll give a quick overview. And then, as I mentioned before, kind of highlight a couple of those key points. So chapter 1, the beginning. So in 2010, so it's been around for a while. In 2010, the iOS app was created, I think by Deloitte. Where it could do basically a lot of all the functionality it can do today, even paying your bills. And then a couple of years later, in 2013, Android joined the party with their app. And then it kind of goes to a bit of the dark ages, I suppose, up to about 2015, where it didn't really get too much love. And it was around there that it was still sitting around 2 stars rating on the App Store. The following year, war on the bugs. So that's when the team really started trying to focus a little bit more on the customers and listening a lot more and just trying to get back to some of the basics of ironing out some of the bugs, try and make it a lot more stable. And also introduce some new functionality. So key things like push notifications, when you get a notification when your parcel's on its way or it's coming tomorrow. And that was, I suppose, the start of the time it really started to change. And the app rating kind of just started to slowly climb up from there. 2017. So this is the time that I joined. So just over 2 years ago. And a really interesting thing when I joined on was I found out there'd never been any user testing done on the app. What? So, I mean, there've been a lot of, they've done a lot of user testing, but a lot of the time, whenever a new feature or a new capability came out, it was being tested for the web. And then after that testing, they'll go, cool, now let's build the exact same thing in the app. And it was built basically identical, which kind of makes you question what's the point of having an app. But that was really interesting when we joined that there hadn't been done any user testing. So one of the first things we did was do some user testing on the app. And it was a very basic thing, but gave us so much information. So we did a simple thing called getting a customer effort score, which is pretty simple. We gave them a whole bunch of tasks with the app, and then you essentially ask, like, how easy was it for you to complete this task? Sometimes this scale changes a little bit, but for us, we just rated it from 1 to 5. We got the user to rate it from 1 to 5. 5 being it was awesome, it was really easy. 1 being no, couldn't do it at all. And what we found was some really basic functionality, like in the app, being able to add a tracking number to be able to track actually didn't perform all that well. And it's some of these things which you wouldn't necessarily find by analytics alone. And of course, we found the app was like a Swiss Army knife. It could do a whole lot of stuff, but didn't really focus on some of those key activities that a lot of people used. So this was another really key tipping point, was doing this first activity of just getting these customer effort scores for some key tasks. And then off the back of that, we decided, a lot of the navigation needed to be restructured. And so we also took that opportunity to do a bit of a redesign of the app as well. Since we're going to have to be shuffling around a lot of the core navigation, some of the pages were really going to have to be rebuilt. So we thought, it was looking a little bit outdated and it was really inconsistent with the design. Why not uplift the whole design at the same time? Which is a really interesting thing if you've ever tried to, I suppose, do a redesign of a product, trying to get that off the ground and really get buy-in for the business. Like, how do you justify spending a bunch of time or effort doing a redesign? So what I found, if you can kind of meet an intersection of these 3 key areas, then you're in a really good place. So for us, for the business, we knew from testing with some of these customer effort scores, that if we could fix some of that navigation, we would get a lot more people using some of the delivery options or preferences, which saved AusPost money. And we could justify this because we did a couple of iterations of prototypes and how the navigation would change, and we saw those customer effort scores go up and get a lot better. Then from a tech perspective, so for us, as crazy as it was as well, in the app, we didn't really have reusable components. So something like a button. Over time, more and more designers had worked on the app and different features had come in, and almost every button looked slightly different. Most of them were red with some white on it, but it varied slightly, which meant if we ever needed to do any change, you had to do it everywhere. So we took this opportunity as well. If we could set up a design system where it's the same components everywhere, that would greatly increase development time down the track. And then, of course, for the customer. So if we knew it was going to be easier to use, but then also it would have a bit of a fresher design, as well as really trying to focus on those key flows. So for a couple of examples, this is what the app looked like on Android on the left here and iOS on the right. So one of the very first things, I suppose, was the navigation. So on Android, we had the classic hamburger menu that expanded out to have all these options. And on iOS, we had the tab at the bottom and then that More tab, which had all that information there. What we found was this was, really hard to denote hierarchy as well. What were those key actions? Some of all these linked off to websites, and some you could actually do in the app. As well as it just wasn't really discoverable. So on Android, every time you want to check out what one of these things do, you have to basically tap the button a couple of times. So where we ended up after a couple of rounds of prototyping was, so we've got this new navigation down the bottom. It's a little bit simpler, but then this is also the More tab. It's kind of stretched down where we tried to really elevate some of those maybe less common components, the actions like paying a bill or finding a postcode, but they're built natively as opposed to some of all the other web links and everything we put down. Unfortunately for the first slice, really for the app, we couldn't just start ripping stuff out of the app. There's a lot of stakeholders, but this was a good first stepping stone. Then the track list. So this is what it used to look like on the left here. You've got your list of all your items you're tracking. And if you tap on one of them, you get the detail on the right. So pretty busy. There's a lot going on there, a lot of buttons. But yeah, a lot of content. It's actually a really tricky one, track, when you try and delve into it. It seems so simple, but there's so much nuance in it. Then it turned into something which looked a bit more like this. A lot more colors, but also it started to denote a lot more of the hierarchy as well. It's a little bit easier to glance over everything. And a typical person's track list doesn't have this many buttons. That was just for designing. I quickly skimmed through these. This was the addresses tab, changed it to a count tab, made it a little bit clearer. And of course, after we rolling it all out, so we spent just a couple of months really focusing on, I suppose, the core navigation. We didn't do every single page, every single aspect. You know, how did it go? So it's great to see. I mean, we got a whole bunch of ratings which explicitly called out the design, which is really good and surprising. And we ended up last year, we won at the UX Asia Awards. Actually, we got a silver award for best use of mobile, which is pretty cool. So I suppose that takes us to chapter 7, which is currently in progress this year. So I suppose we've talked a lot about the App Store rating, but why does that even matter? Well, for us, it's a really good indication for understanding the overall sentiment of users. So sometimes you can have an NPS score, but an app rating, while it's quite different, is just a baked-in metric, which is really easy to look at. It's also helped us within AusPost really build a bit more of a reputation, where I think previously the app was the lost child that wasn't really taken care of. And so now that we've started bringing up that App Store rating, it's really helped get a bit more that reputation internally, to hopefully help a lot more stuff come soon. Plus, for the team, it's a good sense of accomplishment. You've got your benchmark where you can see it changing. You can see that rolling these things out is making a difference. So that's kind of the story of the AusPost app, but I want to really, I suppose, get you to think internally. If you work on a product, if you work on an app or a website or a web app, or whatever it is, what's the story of your product? So you may not have been there long, but maybe over the last couple of years, how has it shifted? How has it changed? What features maybe rolled out? Was there key milestones or events? Because sometimes it can be so easy to get in the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day, just trying to focus on the one thing, but take a step back and think, where have we come from? Where are we going as well? And think about how you can influence that going forward. And of course, the stories are never ending. So a good throwback to the never ending story if you've seen that. And of course, it's all about trying to influence going forward. Because what I found is when I joined, there'd been a lot of whispers and talks about, oh, maybe we should do a redesign. Oh, I don't know. And it can sometimes get that bit of a bystander mentality where everyone's kind of waiting for someone to tell them what to do. So sometimes having that very deliberate thought of this story, where's it going, where do you want to direct it, can be really helpful. But of course, the customer effort scores that I mentioned, having really great customer effort scores doesn't necessarily mean you get a 5-star app. It's not just one simple thing and there's no silver bullet. So I'm going to dive in a little bit more to, I suppose, 3 key elements from what I think is really important. And I think all this applies to any product you might be working on, not just the app or working on apps. So the first thing is a bit of a customer feedback loop. So how easily do you know what your customers actually want or feel at any given time? It can be so easy to fall into a trap of just theorizing as well, without even realizing it. You can just start guessing, this is what customers want, they probably want this, but how do you actually know? And which is really important for everyone, not just designers or product owners, but even developers, just understanding what customers want. I came across this really interesting example the other day. I was listening to a podcast. I don't know if anyone's listened to it, called Business Wars. Really great podcast. But they pit together 2 different companies over time, what happened. But there's this really interesting example I heard of DC Comics. So this is around the 1960s. DC was like well ahead. They'd been ahead for ages, and Marvel had come along and they started to release some new characters, and Marvel started exploding, and DC was in a bit of trouble. And And so DC did what every good company does when they're in a little bit of trouble. They held a good big executive meeting. And what they did, they basically just talked about what is it the Marvel's doing that we're not doing? And they pinned up Marvel comics all around the wall and looked at them and like, what is it that Marvel's doing? I'm like, oh, maybe it's Marvel's using a lot of red. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's what people want. So maybe we should use some red. Someone else thought that, you know, the Marvel illustration style was quite different. It's a little bit more crude, less blocky. They thought, oh, maybe kids really like that because it looks like something that they could draw themselves. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's what they like. Of course, they completely missed the point. The key thing was that DC just focused just on kids, but Marvel really expanded to try and have richer characters that worked for everyone. And so something that DC did was they made this new checkerboard pattern at the top, which they called their go-go checks. And the whole purpose of that was to try and make it stand out. So they were promoting to everyone, hey, when you go to buy a comic, make sure you look out for those checks. So you make sure you're not buying a Marvel one by mistake. Because they thought they must just be buying Marvel comics by mistake. And once they rolled that out, it actually had the opposite effect. Everyone could look out for the checks and go, okay, cool, I won't buy that one. So I think the key thing is to really not get caught in the trap of just theorizing what customers want and just guessing. As really silly as that sounds, sometimes to a different degree, we can get caught in that trap every day. So having an app is really gold because you got an inbuilt feedback mechanism. So talking about App Store ratings. Now this is such a really simple thing, but super effective for us and our team is on Slack, we've got a Slack channel which has a bot which automatically posts as soon as someone leaves a new review. And so we can instantly see them all. Now, it's not always just flooded with 5 stars like that. Sometimes, you know, it's a 1-star or a 2-star thrown in there. And that's the point because what we find is as soon as, you know, you get a 1-star review, everyone reads it every day. We probably get about 5 of them a day. So it's not absolutely flooded, but it's enough for us to deal with. Because it's important to understand what is it that users actually like about the app as well. But then more importantly, when stuff goes wrong, what don't they like about it? And of course, it's a customer feedback loop. It's not just about reading information from our customers, it's trying to feed that back into the product. So here's a cool example. I think it was from like a week or 2 ago. You know, someone left a 1-star review saying they had this issue. And we reached out to them and resolved the issue. And within a couple of hours, they'd updated their rating to be 5 stars, which is pretty cool. So to quickly recap with that, you know, try not to get into the trap of just guessing, but also not just simply reacting as well. So as I mentioned earlier, where we did user testing, that was the first time we'd really been proactive, really reaching out to the customers first. And this is something we're always constantly trying to improve within our team. We haven't got down pat yet either. So yeah, I really believe without that constant feedback loop, we wouldn't have such a high rating as we do now. Which also leads into the next theme. So the team, the team is king. So in reality, I mean, your product is only as good as your team because you could have some real cool fancy designs, you can have some real cool intentions, but the customer or the user only sees what ends up in production. So I found having that feedback channel I just showed has really helped build, you know, passion within the team as well. Everyone's latched on the App Store rating and is really passionate about turning stuff around really quickly. So our team is really super motivated, passionate, but also close-knit. So we all sit really close together and have that constant communication. Not to say that your team needs to sit together. As long as you've got a constant communication across everyone, I think that's the key thing. Especially for having free-flowing conversations between designers and developers as well. It can be very different at different companies, but sometimes it can be a bit like a design shop where the designers sit separately, they design something, hand it over, and then that's it. So I think that's one of the key things as well. So I think designers have a real great opportunity where they can really help shape features to help get buy-in simply by just having some screens or some mock-ups, even really early on with the concept. And so designers try to start designing a bit more openly with the devs involved as well. And then, of course, you've got the devs, which have a really great understanding inside and out of the product, what you can do and what you can't do. And especially when it comes to native apps, there's so many new frameworks and everything coming out all the time. they usually have a really good understanding of that. So a really key example is, so rating the app. We used to have this old mechanism. It was classic. In every app, you'd probably seen something similar. After you've been using it for a bit, it would ask you, hey, we value your feedback. Why not rate us? We have a button, you can tap to rate it now, which would spit you out to the App Store, or you could get reminded to do it later. Well, one of our devs, knew that there was this new framework, this new capability that Apple had just released. And it wasn't even around the time that Apple normally releases their frameworks during WWDC. It was a different time. And we latched onto it. So what it was it now allowed us to present it something like this, where you could tap the star rating and then a button would come up saying submit, and you tap submit, and it's much easier to leave a rating. So, our theory was, yeah, cool, this will probably increase the number of people giving a rating. We'd heard things like it did. But also that could be a little bit risky as well. If our app wasn't in a good state, it could completely destroy the app rating. But vice versa, if we did feel comfortable that it was in a good place, it could really help it. So just before we introduced the new prompt, we were getting on iOS, about 30 ratings a week. Does anyone want to guess, after we just simply swap the prompts, how many ratings we were getting a week? Any guesses? Went from 30 to 200, 400? Yeah, good guesses. So we went to a bit over 2,000 a week. And you can see just from that little thing, I think this is one of the key secrets that really changed our App Store rating, where we were really low, and then you can see where it went live. But that, wouldn't have happened if the app wasn't in a good place as well. So I think that's, just to reiterate, that's really important from that communication standpoint. So we wouldn't have known about that without having the constant communication with devs. But it's also important to have the designers in those conversations too. And then my final point that this leads into, once you have a great team, it's really important to have that, to be able to build experiences that exceed expectations. And ultimately, that's what people are rating when they give you an App Store rating. Is this better than I thought it would be? Or, some people rate differently. They might give 5 stars if it's cool, it does what it's meant to do. But some people aren't that nice. So have a think about, if you are working on an app, what are those expectations that people go in with? So for us, one of the key things we changed was to stop trying to mimic the web and stop trying to do the exact same stuff as a web and put it in an app. We want to really take advantage of the platform of the app and the context. So people use apps very differently. Apps have different capabilities in the web. So for us, is really key about focusing on that context, not necessarily being consistent across platforms. Of course, you want to be consistent within your own platform whenever you can, but sometimes, depending on the context, I think it's important to shake up that consistency and take advantage of any changes. So if this was your scale of expectations, we don't want to just go for the happy ones. We want to go for much happier. It's shooting for the stars. And a key thing, going back to earlier where I talked about the customer effort scores that we did rating for some of our testing, this kind of changes your mentality as well when you can conduct some of that testing. So rather than, if someone rates something a 3, this task was only a 3, rather than just asking, okay, why did you rate it a 3? And understanding that and leaving it at that, ask them what could make it a 5, or what could make it more than a 5, and then try and exceed that. And if you're aiming for pretty high, even if you fall short, hopefully you're kind of right up there. So now I'm going to give some key examples of some features where I think we probably exceeded some expectations within the app. So here's a really key interaction in the app is you go to add a tracking number. So after you tap add in the top right-hand corner, you enter a tracking number and tap add. Cool. We updated the design a bit, made it this cool panel. How could we exceed expectations here? We already implemented some stuff so that you wouldn't even have to enter the tracking number. So most of the time when you buy something online, it gets matched automatically and it's in your track list. That's awesome. But we still found that like thousands of times a day, people are adding tracking numbers manually. And we had a theory that most of the time people probably aren't typing it all out. They might be copying it from somewhere else. Maybe they got it in an email or someone messaged it to them. They copied it, right? So we decided to take it rather if you went to copy something, rather than just saying this, when you go to add it, you now saw this. So it says the last thing you copied looks like a tracking number, so we've entered it for you. And it's one of those little things where, I mean, it saves them, what, maybe one extra tap of having to tap paste, but it's one of those key things which, I mean, they weren't expecting it and can be a real delight opportunity. And just go over another real quick example as well, where sometimes when you might have a tracking number and it's not actually in our system yet. We used to have this where it'd say, sorry, it's not in our system yet. Where now we implemented a new feature where you have the button to save and check later, or save for later. And now it'll save on your phone so that next time maybe you open the app, it'll check it for you automatically, so you don't have to do that yourself. And while the reason we focus on some of these examples is just from the sheer volume that a lot of people add tracking numbers. Even though the app can do so much other stuff, this is really key. And I think there's another example. We recently redid all our registration, our login and sign up flow. And this is another really cool one that came from the devs. I had no idea that we could even do this. On Android now, when you go to sign up, it can show you a list of all the Gmail accounts you logged into on your phone already. And then if you tap on one of those, it skips the need to even verify your email. Where previously we'd send you an email, you'd have to go out, tap the verification link. So now all you do is you tap that, type in your new password, your name is pre-filled, and then tap submit. And something which, you know, could have taken you a couple of minutes now only takes about 10 seconds. Now you've created an account and you're logged into the app. Yeah, so as I mentioned, that's one of those other key things as well, which you wouldn't have known without talking to the devs. My final example I want to go through is talking about parcel lockers. So has anyone, I mean, seen parcel lockers around? Has anyone actually used a parcel locker? Yeah, a decent amount. Cool. So, I mean, they're a really great product from Australia Post. I'm not trying to plug it. It's actually really cool. So they're completely free. It's a free collection point, like temporarily. So where you get a unique address for free after signing up, never costs anything, where you can just send Australia Post parcels to that unique address. And then we'll notify you when it's ready to collect, and you have 48 hours to collect them. But the cool thing is you can typically collect at any time, 24/7. So you don't have to wait for when the post office is open. Right now, if you sign up for a parcel locker, typically, yeah, you get an SMS when it's ready to collect, which is pretty cool. I mean, it's a pretty straightforward process. You get your SMS, you go to the parcel locker, you tap collect, you enter your mobile number, and then you enter the 6-digit code that we sent in the SMS, and then pop, the locker opens and grab your thing. So how could we try and exceed expectations for this experience with the app? Well, this is what we ended up with. So, I mean, you get a push notification when it's ready to collect. And then cool, that may just remind you, okay, it's ready to collect. After work, I'll go get it. But now as you approach the parcel locker, when you go to collect it, boom, you get another notification with a QR code. All you need to do is expand that and you simply scan it from the parcel locker and it just pops open. So you don't need to enter your mobile number or an access code or anything. So that's, I suppose, another kind of key example of where, you know, people have expectations of what they think the app could do, and then we just try and step that little bit further to exceed those. So that is all about exceeding expectations. And so that a lot of that's talking about the app and the different contexts and capabilities of an app, you know, using geofencing and push notifications in your clipboard. Sometimes you can't do that in a website. But the key thing is just thinking about that context of what the user is going to do and how that may differ. So on a website, it may mean, you know, it's very different on a full desktop where you've got a lot of screen real estate. Maybe you can deal with a lot more hover states and drop downs as opposed to when you're on mobile web where maybe you want to promote the key actions a little bit more. So there are those 3 key points. So ultimately being customer-centric is all about having those conversations with customers. So how often do you actually listen to your customers? Do you have that customer feedback loop in place? So being reactive with things like that Slack channel example or looking at app store ratings, but also being proactive, making sure you're doing things like user testing. The next thing is the team is the king. So how's your communication within your team? How intertwined are your devs and designers to try and help build products that can exceed expectations? So think about that context, how you can push it a little bit more. Embrace that context over consistency. So they're those key things. So the final thing I just want to leave with you, I suppose, is just once again, think about your story. What's your story for your product? So with all those things in mind, how can you influence the story of your product going forward? And that's it. That's me. Get back!